Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by Ed Broadbent. He is a former Canadian politician who served in the Canadian Parliament for 2 decades, and as the head of its New Democratic Party from 1975 to 1989, he's also served as director of the International Center for Human Rights and Democratic Development and currently chairs the Broadbent Institute. He is the author of a new book, Seeking Social Democracy, 7 Decades in the Fight for Equality. Ed Broadbent, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
It's an immense pleasure on my part to talk directly to an American audience.
Well, because we have an American audience, we might want to start with a little bit of a lay of the land for Canadian politics. So for those who don't know the status of the New Democratic Party within the system, but perhaps you could explain to us what the basic factional alignments are and where you fit within it.
Well, you have to start with the structure of a parliamentary democracy like ours, as opposed to a presidential system like yours. Ours depends, in terms of the selection of the prime minister, it depends on the number of seats he or she obtains in the House of Commons. And if you don't get enough seats, that is a majority plus one, then you have to work out an arrangement with another party. Historically, in Canada, for the past 6 or 7 decades, that has meant the larger party, liberal or conservative in Canada, has had to work with a smaller party, namely New Democratic Party of Canada, for most of that period. And the consequence is that we as a party, and this is going on as you and I are having a conversation right now, our party constitute a sufficient number of seats to give the Liberal Party of Mr. Trudeau a governing majority. And for that, and this is the social democratic element and impact, the Liberals have to do certain things. And again, as we speak, they're introducing piecemeal, as there won't, but real, a universal dental care program to see that every child in Canada has free dental service or virtually free. And this is a consequence of a deal worked out between the Social Democratic Party, my party, and the Liberals. The Liberals wanting to do it in order to stay in power. They'll get our votes as long as they do this. This is a shortened version, if you could go, I can go on at some length, of the series of social democratic measures over time: universal health care, universal pensions, a pharmacare program, that the New Democratic Party has been able to extract from a larger party as a condition for our votes in the House of Commons.
So you, as the Social Democrats and Socialists in Canada, don't get to rule, but you do get to extract, as you say, concessions, and you do have to. I mean, I assume this involves a lot of very difficult and complicated negotiations of figuring out, how to use your power, when to withhold the power that you have, what you're going to expend it on. They need you, but also they can defy you if how does this work? Tell us a little more about this.
Yes, that's why in the present circumstance, for example, there was a 3-year agreement signed publicly by the leaders of both parties. So it's an official public commitment to the maintaining of the Liberals in power on the condition they met certain social, especially social policy requirements, but also action on the environment. I should mention this being equally important with the present government.
It sounds as if oftentimes the Liberals are not going to do the right thing unless they're forced to.
That's to put it euphemistically, yeah. Well, the father of the present Prime Minister, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, a man that I dealt with virtually throughout my political life, did say to me in private one time he liked having the New Democratic Party around because he could always threaten the more right-wing members of his caucus if they didn't comply with certain social policy initiatives. Then they would lose the support in the country and lose it to the NDP and not form a government. And if there's anything a liberal dislikes more than injustice, it's having himself rejected from power.
I seem to remember that in the book you write about this, and you write that he kind of suggested, oh, we like having you because you make it easier to do the thing that we actually want to do. And then I seem to recall you have a kind of skepticism of this, which is the same skepticism that, in fact, Luke Savage, who collaborated with this with you on this book, and I wrote about in Current Affairs about Barack Obama, who was always suggested, where we analyze, well, what does he really want to do? And then the question is, well, what does he do when he is not constrained or is not forced to do these things? And I seem to recall you have a comment in here where you say, well, I'm not quite sure I believe that he wanted to implement our agenda and was satisfied when we made him do it.
That's true. I had that skepticism. But generally in political life, I figured it was a mug's game to try to guess the motives of your political opponents. All politicians, by definition, at some level, are self-interested, or they would not be in politics. And so the key thing for me is to watch what people do, not what they say. And that's the real stuff. And that was a good relationship we had, for example, with Pierre Elliott Trudeau. One could see explicitly what he did and what he didn't do.
Well, going back to your time as party leader, maybe you could tell us a bit more about, what your kind of social democratic agenda was and how, maybe an example of how you managed to use the leverage that you had to alter government policy without yourselves being in an ultimate position of power.
Well, one very clear example that came during the energy crisis in the early 1970s. And there was a discussion in principle of whether or not the state, some government agency, would own all or part of our petroleum industry. The Liberals had come up with a plan that intimated they would be interested in creating what we call as a Crown Corporation, which is a big state enterprise, but they hadn't done it. At this particular time, I was chair of the New Democratic Party caucus, not the leader, but the chair of the caucus. But on the instructions of the caucus as a whole, I went to a senior minister, Mr. Trudeau, in the early days of 1971, I think, just before the Christmas break, and said, for example, to this minister, politely but clearly, that if they didn't announce and take steps to fulfill the announcement, the creation of Petro-Canada, a state enterprise in the oil industry, if they did not do that before Christmas, we would vote to bring the government down, and there would be a general election. That was an explicit commitment, if you like, I made on behalf of my caucus. And it was clearly understood by the Liberal minister. And within a matter of days, they did announce the creation of Petro-Canada, which in its early years turned out to be a very large and on the whole successful public enterprise. And that's one of the clear examples people could see up front about what was happening.
Well, what's interesting is you say in your book, the creation of Petro-Canada represented a union of hard-headed practical politics and social democratic philosophy. And I want to talk about practical politics versus social democratic philosophy, because you began as an academic, as a political economist, and then you entered this world of politics where but in addition to ideas and theory, you have to think about what is justice, what is the good, what is the arrangement of a decent society. You have to think about power. And you say elsewhere in the book, I believe that you have some quote, I don't want to misquote you, but you say that like the number one priority of party leader, or at least the thing I have to think about before anything else, is seeking and holding power. Because without power, you can't do anything.
Well, a variation of the question is, when you're in politics, are you there to sit in seats of power, or are you there to make speeches and influence those who are sitting in seats of power? And there had been a minority tradition in Canada of some people thinking, largely outside the party, is that the role of the Democratic Party is not to obtain power, but to provide simply ideas and pressure on one of the larger parties historically to do things. I don't share that view, and the majority of the members of my party don't share that view. And indeed, my predecessors as leader, David Lewis and Tommy Douglas and J.S. Woodward, historic figures in Canadian politics, they didn't go into politics simply to influence others by being brilliant debaters. And by the way, they were normally the best debaters in the House of Commons. But they went into politics to actually make the political decisions, to write the laws and not just express the values supporting laws. So you got perhaps the most significant thing in Canadian social policy, universal Medicare. It came after a very intense political fight in the province of Saskatchewan, during which time the medical profession went on strike. But eventually the legislation was passed, and passed by a new Democratic Party government. It would not have happened, in my view, or the view of most historians, without the NDP, or at that time, it was a predecessor party. It was a Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, was a predecessor to the NDP, and it was in power at the time, and part of the reason for it being elected to power was its commitment to bring in universal health care. And when they had the power, they did so in a very intense political situation.
Well, I'd love to get any advice that you have from how Canadians got their healthcare system for those of us in the United States. Your book is called Seeking Social Democracy. Many of us in the US probably feel like, well, you up in Canada have found social democracy, certainly to a greater extent that we have here. Looking back on that fight, as you say, it was a fight even in Canada. It's not like it was easy there either. What can you tell us about the lessons that you think come out of, to the extent that Canada has found social democracy, what we should learn from it?
Well, what I learned from it is the experience of our party in the prairies, in Saskatchewan and in Manitoba, in both of which provinces the NDP is governed, is that it is implemented step by step. There may be at times sort of revolutionary rhetoric, but the reality is something non-revolutionary, and it's incrementalism, but very successful. Let me illustrate that the CCF came to power in Saskatchewan in 1948, but it didn't implement the Medicare part of their program until 1961. And the reason, in part, is all kinds of earlier steps had to be taken by that government to build up confidence, so that when it took something that was going to be seen to be a profound change in the arrangements of society, the society, at least 50%, would agree with what they're doing. So the lesson that I learned, because I grew up in a different province, but I learned from our Saskatchewan success, is you must make real promises and then implement them, but do it with the good support of the population. A certain moderation at all times is required, but the moderation does not excuse doing nothing. Moderation can be done by showing respect to the political opposition, but in the final analysis, you must carry out your promise. But the promises should be gradual and not revolutionary at the outset.
You're listening to the Current Affairs podcast from Current Affairs magazine in New Orleans, Louisiana. Current Affairs is a registered 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we depend entirely on reader subscriptions and donations. You'll notice we have no ads, no mattresses, no recruiters, no sports betting. If you can help us in our mission to build independent progressive media, please visit currentaffairs.org/donate to make a donation, or currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our beautiful print magazine. Thank you so much for supporting our work. Now, back to the program. I want to continue on the theme of how to be a pragmatic politician as a socialist. You became quite popular and respected in Canada during your party leadership as a reputation for being honest and plain-spoken. You mentioned Tommy Douglas, who, as I understand it, is routinely voted one of, if not the greatest Canadians of all time. You in Canada you've been a socialist politician with some measure of broad popularity and success. And I think in the United States, we who consider ourselves socialists struggle with our kind of marginality, and we try and think. And there's this conventional wisdom that only you have to run to the center if you want to actually win. You didn't do that, but perhaps you can tell us what the secret is to maintaining your socialist principles, but achieving broad popularity or speed to a broad audience.
Well, I'm tempted to say that I don't know an answer to that. As the title of the book that came out summarizing my experience in politics recently had the title "The Pursuing Social Democracy." And in that collection of essays and discussions, you'll find the view that I have that social democracy, in a sense, doesn't exist. It's something that's being constantly pursued by people on the left. And what's being pursued is to whittle away at the role of the market and the market's allocation of so many goods and services. Because when the market does it, everybody understands it has a high degree of inequality. The rich tend to benefit more from market mechanisms than the average and the poor. So a social democratic attitude to this is that we have to get away from too much allocation of goods and services in society on the basis of market, because the average and the poor don't get a fair share that way. So to get a fair share, you can either use tax policy to narrow the gap between the rich and the poor, or you can take a certain service out of the market entirely and persuade your fellow citizens that the way of dealing with, for example, healthcare, instead of a competitive model, which is so wasteful of resources, bring it all within one framework and remove needless so-called competition. And you can do this with a number of aspects of life, not just medical services, but other social services. And it's a requirement to show the practicality of that, not just the ideological difference between us, say, and the other parties, but the difference that we are favoring has concrete benefits. And you can show what those benefits are in your argumentation when you're trying to persuade the Canadians to move from the status quo to one of greater social democracy.
Certainly, showing that left social democratic socialist policies actually help people and convincing them of that seems a very important political lesson for those of us on the left. In addition to this, you started as an academic. You started as a kind of theorist, and you had to learn to speak to people and convey left ideas in a way that they understood and appreciated. There's one part in the book where you're talking about sort of what you learned from George Orwell and Politics of the English Language, and you stopped using, say, working class, because people don't really define themselves that way. You started talking about ordinary Canadians. And, it's an effective language. You don't change the left ideas, but you think about how do you present these ideas in a way where everyone, and not just those who are already grounded in left theory or have an understanding of Marxism, kind of appreciate what you're trying to do.
I'm inclined to say to what you just said, yes.
Okay, sorry. Well, but tell us more about how you talk to people about left ideas.
Yeah, it's very important about how you talk to people. They have to sense that two things. By definition, you're talking to them as an advocate of a different set of political policies or programs that they understand, you understand. What's very important is in that context, you convey the message to them that you respect them as human beings. You don't look down at them as being somehow inferior because they aren't in agreement with your whole program for the moment. You have to sense that as a fellow human being, they have a different set of claims in the political process, and they are not the same as yours, but you have to respect their right to pursue them. So conservative political opponents in my hometown, I went door to door in 1968 to move, I guess I did, though I didn't know it at the time, a significant plurality of voters to come over to the NDP, and I won by the grand total of 15 votes. But my own intuitive, it was a very rich learning experience for me, going door to door in my hometown and talking to people, and to some extent playing a role in persuading them to switch from conservative bias, if you like, to a social democratic one.
How do you convince people to switch that?
With a great effort. For example, housing was a big issue in 1968. And we had a particular housing program that included public housing, that included fixed rate mortgages at a low level for certain income ranges of people. It had, if I recall correctly, a tuition-free federal university support program. Then I think to give $1,000 to any high school graduate and let him or her pick the university that they wanted. At that time, but $1,000 was quite substantial. So the point I'm making, even in 1968, we had a concrete agenda. You could call it socialism, social democracy, or porridge, if you like. The key thing is what it stood for, substantively. And what it stood for was a real change in people's lives.
That tradition that you say, you call it social democracy, socialism, whatever you want to call it. In some ways, you are, in this book, you're articulating a political tradition that sadly waned over the course of the 80s and 90s, with the rise of neoliberalism. And you talk in the book about how it used to be that when the term third way was used, it would be a third way between United States-style free market capitalism and Soviet communism. There'd be a kind of democratic socialism. In the 1990s, third way became associated, certainly here, with Bill Clinton, the third way being neoliberal market fundamentalism with a sprinkling of social democracy, as we might call it. So tell us a little bit more about that old tradition that we need to sort of re-examine and reclaim of that third way that you were part of.
I really like this question because it goes to the heart of political reality today. There were real choices in the 1990s. It didn't have to go in a neoliberal direction, but Blair, Bill Clinton, they opted for a more market-driven society than any social democratic leader had ever done. And I think that was a big mistake on their part. It led, in my view, to the Democratic Party's disenfranchisement of the working class in the U.S. Since workers in my kind of hometown, that is to say, in cities in Michigan, Ohio, and nearby the so-called Rust Belt, well, the neoliberal political philosophy create that Rust Belt, help move capital away from the U.S., largely, but by no means exclusively, to China, withering away a really proud social structure that provided real opportunity for millions of Americans for several decades. So with this acceptance by these political leaders, Schroeder is the other fellow I'm trying to think of, Gerhard Schroeder, the head of the Social Democrats in Germany for a while. They made a big mistake by accepting the Thatcherite model of a small state and big capital. And we in Canada, if I may say so, never fully went in that direction. Both Prime Ministers Mulroney and Chrétien took steps to eliminate parts of the welfare state, but they were only marginally successful in that effort. And one of the reasons, I believe, that didn't go further in Canada is the existence of the NDP and our refusal to go in a neoliberal direction. And by our refusal to do that, we helped shift the political consensus in Canada in a more progressive direction than that of the United States, for example.
There's a kind of, I would describe it as a myth or a misconception that compromising your values is the pragmatic course rather than staying firm. And it seems that you're providing an example of how, resisting the compromises there that were made elsewhere was in fact actually the pragmatic course for those who held your values and vision for the good society.
That's true. I believe that to be true. And that's a theme of the book. And people reading it can make their own judgment if I'm right about that.
I did want to bring up, because you mentioned Germany, a figure that comes up repeatedly in your book is Willy Brandt, who you say that kind of certainly neglected in the United States, but exemplified this kind of, for you, this kind of third way, this kind of possibility of a democratic socialism that rejected the bleak authoritarian socialism of the Eastern Bloc and also the horrendous free market capitalism under which we find ourselves here in the United States today.
That's right. Willy Brandt was the symbolic figure of that. After all, he had fled Germany. He fled the Nazis in the end of the Second World War. He went to Scandinavia to avoid persecution by Nazis. And so he had great credibility in Germany after the war for being opposed to everything the Nazis stood for. So he was for me, and I got to know him personally, a shining light of a social democratic personality. He had a great sense of joy for life. Life was not something to be endured; it was to be enjoyed, and he embodied that. But he also embodied the program agenda of reducing inequality. First in Germany, and then when he was mayor of Berlin, he acted on that. He had great courage facing the Soviet state while he was a mayor at one point. What I would regard the real free world, namely that of social democrats in Sweden, Norway, Austria, the Netherlands, and Canada, and the U.S. Michael Harrington, I mentioned in this, I put him in. He didn't possess power, but he possessed a lot of good ideas. He came from the U.S., and they had an agenda that, as you indicated, was against both Soviet-style authoritarianism and against the total free market capitalism. And it was a so-called third way then that sought and was successful in those countries to bring a greater degree of equality. If you look at the Western European countries between 1945 and 1975, and indeed look at the US and Canada in that period, there's a decisive move in the direction of social democracy, mitigating the power of the market and expanding, in a democratic sense, the power of the state.
And I mean, you argue in the book that socialism without democracy is essentially not socialism, right? And you have this remarkable account of your encounters with Fidel Castro, where you tried to convince him to hold elections, and he just wasn't interested at all.
That's absolutely true, and it's actually very sad because for a while he had legitimate popularity, I would say. We brought in, for a low-income country, wonderful medical programs and universal education, but he was absolutely no friend of political and civil rights. And that's been the tragedy of Cuba. And had he moved, even after he'd been in power 10 years, had he moved in a direction of elections, he might have saved all the good results of what they had done in terms of education and health. People probably would have retained those policies. But if he stayed on as he did, they would just possibly reject everything. not only the authoritarian nature of decision making, but the good practicality of some of the things that they had done. And it's set the stage for just a tragic happening of the Cuban people.
You point out that from your impressions of him, he had a great personal arrogance, this sort of with the 3-hour speeches and on every subject under the sun. He did know a lot, but thought he knew everything. And it gets to this question of, as a leader of people, you have to balance your sense that you have to have a certain arrogance because you're accepting a position of leadership. You're oftentimes going against public opinion or trying to convince the public to support you. On the other hand, you are the representative of the people. You're there to carry out their will. You have to be humble. You have to listen. So based on your experience in leadership, how do you strike that balance between getting ahead of the public and carrying out the public will, between the humility and a little bit of arrogance?
I have no magic formula. Every politician has got to do that on his own or her own, judge the situation they're in, keep respecting the people that the need that you differ with, and provide move with care. But it's also something I want to emphasize. It's important to move. It's important to change in the social democratic tradition. If you don't, you just risk ossification, produce ongoing inequality. Moderation of agenda mustn't turn into abdication of a socialist agenda. I think that's very important. Both things are important. One is to respect people, but the other is to respect your own tradition and the obligation to move ahead.
I want to just conclude here by asking you to give us just a few thoughts on the meaning of the social democracy that you have spent 7 decades, as you say, seeking. How will we know when we have found it if we get near it?
Well, that's the gist of the book is we will never get near it, but we keep struggling for it, and near it means near a final goal. We don't do that, but we can get towards a society that is more equal in its outcomes, enabling people to have a life of joy and satisfaction. Different social democratic indicators can be achieved, but there will always be a constant struggle. We can see that in terms of market-based incomes today. Everywhere in the world where there's social democrats, there's a fight, a continuous one, to stop the rich from gobbling up everything and to bring a greater share to the majority. And the message of the book, whether one agrees or not, is that that'll always be an ongoing struggle. As long as we have a market economy out there of any kind, then we're going to need for progress a social democratic agenda. So that's it.
Well, we will continue the quest forward. We will do our best here in the United States, as you and those who have been inspired by you will continue in Canada, I am sure. I want to just mention that the book that you have produced, which, as I say, current affairs contributor Luke Savage also is one of the collaborators on, is a really, really interesting volume. It's not just an autobiography, but it's got all these wonderful dialogues between you and your collaborators. It has a lot of really interesting appendices of proposals that you have put forward or been part of, speeches that you've given, and to Americans who are kind of interested in finding out about how you have waged crusade for social democracy over in Canada. I was really engrossed by it, and so congratulations on it. So Ed Broadbent, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Thank you very much for having me. All the best to you.
The
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.